Welcome to the Financial Legacy podcast. I am your host, Maria Ellis. On every episode, I will bring you my perspective and the perspective of my guest on financial planning and financial legacy topics. Here on the Financial Legacy podcast, we're changing lives one person at a time by creating your own financial and estate plan and your financial legacy. To help you enjoy your financial success, connect with us at financiallegacy.live for your complimentary consultation. Today with us is Laura Cowan. Laura is a CPA and estate planning attorney and is joining us to help you with your estate planning questions. The New York Times named Laura as the top woman attorney in New York City. Laura is also an entrepreneur. She created a company called She Is Having a Business. So, Laura, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell us about your estate planning practice and why you created a company. It's a great name. She Is Having a Business. Tell us about it. What inspired you?
Yeah, the name is actually She's Having a Business, and it's sort of a play on she's having a baby. My main business is my law practice, which is an estate planning law practice where we draft wills and trusts and healthcare proxies and guardianship documents and all of the documents that you need to make sure that your family and your assets are protected in the event of your death or incapacity. So that's my main practice, my law practice. But then I also have this business called She's Having a Business, which is just a consulting firm, basically, that helps women entrepreneurs get their legal ducks in a row. So my law firm is about 4 years old now, and we are based at 200 Park Avenue, which is in the MetLife building right there at Grand Central.
Yeah, and how did you become interested in estate planning? I know you were prior a CPA and doing very well. What made that switch?
Yeah, so I worked for several years as a CPA before I went to law school. And when I went to law school, I realized I wanted to do things I wanted to practice in an area of law that was, really working with people and helping people. And so estate planning seems like a natural transition. It's a good combination of, working with money and numbers and people's finances and taxes and things like that. But it's also a very personal, area of law. And so it really combines the things that I'm most interested in.
Yeah, and tell us what's the difference. Some of our clients often ask the question, why should I create a trust? Or, when I actually have a will. Tell us the difference between the will, the trust, and what kind of trusts are there?
Yeah, so there's a pretty common misconception out there that, when people start to think I need to kind of quote unquote get my affairs in order,
right.
They think I need a will. And this is what most people think of when they think of getting their affairs in order. There are a lot of downsides that come with a will that a lot of people are unaware of. And then in addition to that, there are a lot of things that a will doesn't do. So one of the big downsides that comes with having a will is that it has to go through probate court before your assets can be distributed according to the terms of the will. And, this surprises a lot of people because they think, well, isn't that kind of the whole point of having a will? So I don't have to deal with the courts and all of that. But it's the exact opposite. If you have a will, and you state your beneficiaries and do all the things that you do with a will, when you pass away, it has to be filed down at the probate court. It needs to go through the probate process before your assets can be distributed. Well, why is this a bad thing? Well, it's a bad thing for 3 reasons. First of all, the probate process is kind of expensive. There are lawyer fees involved with probate, court fees, other kinds of fees. They can all total about 3 to 5% of the estate assets. So in other words, if you pass away and all you have is a home that's worth, say, $1 million, and you have a will that says, I want this home to go to my daughter, probating that will, if you take $1 million times 3%, that's about $30,000 that it's going to cost just to probate that will and that one asset that you specifically said you wanted to go to your daughter. So that's one big downside of probate. Another downside is that it's time consuming. It can take 12 to 18 months to kind of crank through the court process. And during that time, those assets are frozen. So they're not available, to your family and to your heirs. And then the third downside to probate, and this usually comes as a big shock to people, wills become a public record when you pass away. So in other words, when you pass away, your will gets filed down at the courthouse. Anyone can go down and look at it, see who you left your money to, see an inventory of your assets. So this is something that a lot of people don't like the idea of, especially if you have minor children. You don't necessarily want people knowing that they're going to inherit a big chunk of money when they turn 18
Right.
or 21 or whatever age. So there are downsides to having a will from the probate perspective. And then the second thing I would say about wills is that they don't really accomplish as much as people think they do. When you think about the things that you care about in terms of your estate plan, you generally need a trust to accomplish those things. So I'm thinking of, things like you don't necessarily want your kids to get their inheritance when they turn 18 on their 18th birthday.
Too young.
Right, it's too young. I've yet to meet a parent who actually wants that. If you want your kids to get their inheritance, say at age 25 or 30, then you need a trust, right? So there's this big misconception that people think, I don't need a trust. It sounds fancy. It sounds complicated. What they don't realize is the things that you want to accomplish with your estate plan are going to be accomplished not with a will, but with a trust.
Yeah, because in the trust you could also specify, like, if you want to, ladder like maybe a child will get it at 25, at 30, maybe the parent, the mother or dad think, well, by 30 they should be mature enough, right? So they have that layer as well that is possible in the trust. Yeah. So what's the difference between then like a revocable trust versus an irrevocable trust? What are the advantages and disadvantages?
Right. So there's all different kinds of trusts, and they all do different things. They've all got different purposes. Mm-hmm. So a revocable trust is a trust that can be, the terms can be modified or changed or amended. You can revoke the trust entirely. So living trusts, which are the trusts that most of my clients choose to do to avoid probate, those are revocable. You can make changes to them, you can modify them, you can revoke it entirely.
And you don't have to notify the beneficiary.
That's correct.
If say revocable is your own, you could do whatever, right? Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly right. You can do whatever. An irrevocable trust, however, is more set in stone. You can't amend the terms of the trust once you've created the trust and executed it, meaning you've signed it. Mm-hmm. So irrevocable trusts are more often set up when you're trying to minimize your estate tax burden upon your death, for example, or if you're trying to shield assets from creditors. That's when an irrevocable trust might make sense. So it's possible for one person to have some trusts that are revocable, that are accomplishing, one set of objectives, and then other trusts that are irrevocable, that are accomplishing other objectives.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially if you own a business, right? Where you could have a key man insurance as part of that trust.
Right. Yeah. If you're a business owner, you definitely got some other things to think about in terms of your estate planning, where it might make sense to have both revocable and irrevocable trusts doing different things.
Right. So what kind of properties or what kind of assets can you include in those trusts?
So when we're talking about your revocable living trust, which is, I don't think that we really mentioned that when we were speaking about wills and how they come with a number of downsides. The alternative to the will is something called the revocable living trust. Mm-hmm. And this is the option that the vast majority of my clients choose once they've learned more about the downsides of having a will. So a revocable living trust is a will substitute. It's something that you do, instead of your will, where the trust document itself specifies the terms of, where you want your assets to go when you pass away and all of that. The benefit of a living trust is that any assets that are held by the trust when you pass away don't have to go through the court system. They don't have to go through probate.
Right.
So in other words, let's say you own a home. You would draft your revocable living trust and you would say in that document, I want my home to go to my daughter when I pass away. And then Right now your home is probably deeded in your individual name, Jane Smith,
Right.
what the deed says. You want to get your home into your living trust because anything that's in your living trust can bypass probate. So you would change the deed. So the deed now reads the Jane Smith Living Trust. And then when you pass away, that home's now in the trust, so it can go down to your daughter without any probate court involvement. So to answer your question, which you had asked a little bit ago, you can put virtually any kind of asset into your living trust.
Right. And I think you made a very important point, and that is, when you buy, for instance, when you buy real estate, you buy a property either as an investment or as your home, it's important to put it in your name and do not include at that point in time in the title your beneficiary, because there are tax consequences about it, correct? Tell us about it a little bit more from the accounting perspective.
Yeah, so that brings up a great point, especially considering real estate. So I often hear people say, well, I own my property, my real estate, and I want it to go to my daughter when I'm gone. So why don't I just add my daughter to the deed, right?
Right.
And then when I die, it'll just go directly to her, and we can bypass all of this probate court stuff. There's a major downside to that most people are not aware of, and that is, if you add your daughter to the deed, she's going to inherit whatever basis in the property you have. So in other words, let's say you bought the property, 15 years ago for $100,000. Now it's worth $500,000. When that property is sold, there's going to be a $400,000 gain, a big capital gains tax, right? If you just add your daughter to the deed, she's going to inherit that $100,000 basis. So when you pass away and she sells, she's going to have a very big tax bill. However, instead of just naming her on the deed, you leave the property to her in your estate plan, she's going to inherit a basis in the property that's the value on the day that you die. Mm-hmm. So when you pass away, your $500,000 home is probably going to be worth about $500,000. So when she sells it, she's going to have zero capital gains. So we're talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars.
That's a lot of money, because what is the current tax rate for long term?
Yeah, so that would be a capital gains tax, and I think it's about 35%. It's a pretty big tax.
So yeah, so that into itself should motivate all of us to do the proper estate planning, right?
It's a great example of why you don't want to do it yourself. There's so many nuances to estate planning that people just don't realize. And that's a great example, because I hear it over and over again. Can I just add my daughter to the deed? And they don't realize that, they're trying to save money on the estate planning or the, probate, but they're actually saddling their daughter with this very low basis, which you don't want.
Yeah, which means they leave a lot of money on the table. This is hard-earned money, So give us some examples of some good estate planning versus a bad estate planning that you have seen in your practice.
Yeah,
we want to avoid that with our clients, right? We want to make sure they do the right thing.
Yes. The first thing that I would do is, first of all, don't try to do it yourself. And I won't belabor the point, but I would just recommend working with a professional, because, it's likely, I know why people try to do it themselves. You think it's probably not that complicated and you're trying to save money, and that's all understandable, but it's going to cost you more in the long run, and you might make a huge mistake like the one we just spoke about.
Right. And also, estate planning is such a difficult process. It's highly emotional. So it is important to have a professional like yourself that guides us through that process.
Yeah, definitely.
And if you have a business, let's say you have a business and you have two children as an example, and one of them loves the business, wants to work with that, wants to continue the legacy with the company, but the other is more a poet that is into arts and has no interest in business, right? So how do you go about something like that? It's very hard. So I'm sure you have some recommendations for something like that.
I do. Is that my phone?
No, that's my phone.
Okay, just making sure. Yeah, so that brings up a great point, which is that most people, if they haven't done any estate planning, they think, well, I don't have a will, I don't have an estate plan. You actually do. It's just that the state of New York has written it for you.
Right.
And what I mean by that is that every state has their own laws that say, well, this is what happens to your money and your assets and whatnot if you pass away without a will or a trust.
Right.
There's a default plan.
Right.
So you have the default plan. And the default plan,
it favors the locality where you live.
Right. So estate planning is really about opting out of the default plan that's currently in place for your assets. In the example that you just gave, it's very possible. The default would be that your business would just go half and half to your two kids, which doesn't make any sense, and you probably wouldn't want that. You might want something different. Another great example of bad estate planning. I work with a lot of young families, so I work with a lot of.
Just for 1 minute in that, before we leave that topic. So in a situation like that, when you have its child, daughter, or son who loves the business and another who has no interest, how do you distribute it equally? What I have seen in many cases is that they actually obtain the key man insurance, so that the insurance, the proceeds of the insurance go to pay the brother who is the artist or the poet or the medical doctor who has no interest in your particular business. And then the other son inherits the whole business and is able to continue that business. Have you seen that often, or what other ways have you seen it done?
Yeah, that's a great way of doing it. Of just basically, equalizing, the dollar value of who gets what, but just being kind of smart about, well, it makes sense for one child to get, this asset and the other child to get a different asset.
Mm-hmm.
So that's definitely a great way of doing it. But I think, going back to some of the other mistakes that I see, I work with a lot of young families. So people who've got minor children at home, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who, kind of doing their first estate plan.
Right.
And, so these are people that if one of the spouses were to pass away, it's likely that the surviving spouse might remarry, or at least it's possible.
It's a possibility, yes.
It's a possibility. That would be reasonable. And so, in that instance, many people haven't considered, well, if I pass away and I leave everything to my spouse, which is kind of a natural, normal thing to do.
At that point in time, you don't think about dying or remarrying, so you don't make any changes, right?
You don't think about the remarrying part, I think, is what, so you think, well, you take it one step. You think, well, if I pass away, everything goes to my husband. Well, and that's fine and that's normal. But one thing that you're probably not thinking about is, well, what happens if, I leave my entire estate to my husband, thinking, or having that money kind of earmarked for our children when he passes away.
Right.
If he remarries, well, right off the bat, his new spouse is going to be entitled by law to a portion of that, because usually you can't just inherit your spouse. Mm-hmm. And what if he remarries and he, a bunch of that money that you had earmarked for your minor children is now going to go potentially to a new spouse? And what if he has children with his new spouse? So you say that and people think, well, oh, I don't want that. And of course you wouldn't want that. And so there are ways that you can draft the documents to kind of protect the money that you've left behind for your children, instead of, just leaving it outright to your spouse and potentially losing it in a second marriage.
Yeah. And also, I'm thinking about, to give you an example, my husband and I have been married 41 years, and we just recently celebrated our 41st wedding anniversary. And I was, I'm lucky to just have had a new, my only granddaughter at this point. She's 14 months old. So now I'm thinking, I'm going to have to update my trust so that I could include her as one of the beneficiaries of the trust. Right? I mean, this is why I think it's important to update your trust all the time. I mean, at least annually. At least look at it, right?
At least look at it annually. Depending on how it's written, you may not have to update it with every new child or every new grandchild. Sometimes, the way I draft my documents, we include what we call after-born children. So, if you have children that happen to be born after the signing of the documents, right, they're just automatically included. But that does bring up a good point, which is that estate planning is not something that you just do once and then never think about again. And you just sign
Right.
your documents, put them on the shelf, never look at it again. It's a lifelong process. That doesn't mean that you have to redo your documents every single year, but it just means that, as your life changes, as the law changes, as your family and your assets change, you just want to revisit your documents to make sure that they still reflect your wishes. And then if you have to tweak the documents, the fee is usually quite a bit less than that initial fee to set everything up.
Right, right, right. No, I think it's very important to do that for sure. Because life changes. I mean, you might divest some assets and buy new ones, as an example. So in our podcast, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of people that are part of our community, but some of them live in the United States and some are globally. Like we have clients in Australia and Turkey and England. What do you recommend people like that are not within the United States? What's the process for them to go through? And in that line, what areas do you cover? Are you global? Are you US based? What's your advice?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned that. I actually gave several presentations last year at the UN
Uh-huh.
to non-citizens, or people who have green cards, or their one spouse is a citizen and one spouse is not.
Right.
So I actually work with a fair number of people who fall into the category that you just mentioned,
Yeah.
and so
What
these are
are they
people.
considered to be non-resident, or what would be something like? Is there a title or a name for it for that category?
Oh, a non-resident. Well, that would be someone who maybe has assets in the United States but doesn't actually live here.
Right.
Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first thing to ask yourself, is, do you have any assets that are in the United States? If you
Hmm.
have assets that are in the United States, it probably makes sense for you to get a United States estate plan covering those assets upon your death.
Right.
So you might own real estate or a home here in the United States. You'd want to get a will or a trust stipulating where that goes when you pass away. But it's possible that you also own a home in France.
Right.
Depending on the country, depending on the asset, you might need a separate estate plan that covers that property.
Okay.
So it's different for everyone because it depends on the asset and it depends on the location of the asset.
Right.
But I would definitely recommend anyone in that category to speak with an estate planning attorney, because it's possible that the estate tax laws are a little bit different for you than they are for someone who's a citizen. It's too complicated to get into it
Right.
now,
Exactly. Yeah.
but
Yeah. For
definitely
that, we need
just
to have another podcast on
yeah.
taxation.
Yeah, it gets very complicated very fast. But the point is, speak to an expert and at least just understand what the issues are, so you can
Right.
make good decisions.
And that brings a good point where we started earlier in the conversation, and that is we may have to have more than one trust, depending on the location, the asset, and it's a living document, actually, right?
A living, breathing document. Yep, exactly. Just like the Constitution. Yeah, it's that's right. It's something that you'll modify as your life goes on,
Mhm.
and that's not something to be kind of afraid of. It's just something that people tend to think, well, I've done my will and it's on the shelf and now I'm done. And you just kind of want to change that mentality and just keep in mind, one of the things that I do is every year my clients just get an automated email from me, basically saying, it's been a year since we spoke. Have any of these things happened? And then there's a very long list of, did you have another child? Did someone pass away? Did you buy life insurance? Did
Right.
you, a huge long list. Any of those things might have an impact on their estate plan. And
Yes.
then if they've had any of those changes, come in and see me and we'll just do a complimentary review to see if we need to tweak the documents.
Yeah, that's actually a very good idea. You're actually very proactive because
Yeah.
oftentimes we do not think about estate planning on an annualized basis. It should be part of the overall goals for the following year, right? Update, review.
It is. And it's sort of funny because, estate planning is definitely something that it's not fun to think about, because
Right.
in theory, we're thinking about in reality, we're
Departure.
thinking about our own death. But
Yeah.
what I always tell people, because then the first thought is, well, I don't want to think about this every year. It's not that fun to think
Right.
about. But the way I like to respond to that is it's really about you're talking about your life or your death, but it's, getting everything organized for when you pass away makes for a better life,
Absolutely. Not
And
only
so,
better life for you in terms of giving you peace of mind and,
yeah.
be able to review and your accomplishments and just leave the proper legacy that you want, right? But it also is very good for the beneficiaries. So they know, your children will know what your wishes are and how to proceed in those very difficult hours, very difficult times. So we're almost, almost at the end of our podcast, but I wanted to ask you sort of a kind of a fun question that I always ask my guests, and that is, if you have now decided to become a CPA or a estate planning attorney, which is a great combination, by the way, because you help your clients with, not only create wealth but also maintain it. Um, what other career would you have chosen and why?
Oh gosh, that's a trick question.
Yes.
That's tough to answer. I know what I would do if I were, independently wealthy and could do anything I wanted, and that would be
Yeah.
I would volunteer full time at the ballet. I would volunteer at New York City Ballet and just kind
Oh,
of
so you
help out
enjoy
behind the
that.
scenes. I love the ballet, and I go all the time, and it's just a big part of my life. So if I had nothing else that I needed to do, I would just volunteer at the ballet 24/7.
So we know already what would be some of your favorite, organizations that you leave money to, right? I
Yes.
mean, that we didn't talk about that, but that's also an important consideration. Like in my case, I promote education for women and girls. I've been doing that for over 25 years, and that becomes part of the legacy again that you want to leave behind. So. Um, yeah. So thank you so much for spending time with us. Tell us a little bit more about how we could reach you or how clients could reach you in the event that they wanted to, talk to us.
Yeah. So the first step with my firm is always to schedule what we call a peace of mind planning session. And this is a meeting we would usually hold in person, but now we're holding virtually during COVID.
Right.
And it's basically a 1 hour Zoom with me. And what we do in that session is we talk about your goals and your objectives and the things that you're concerned about. And then I'll present your various options, how things would play out under different scenarios. We also talk about our fees and our estate planning packages. In terms of our fees, everything we do is a flat fee. We don't bill anything by the hour. So if you decide to move forward, you'll know exactly, what your investment's going to be. So we talk about all of that at the peace of mind planning session. And then if we decide that we're a good fit to work together, we'll take next steps. The fee is normally $450 for the session, but we're waiving that for anyone who listens to your podcast. So
Yeah, thank
it'll
you.
be a complimentary session. You're welcome. So I would recommend even if you just want to know what your options are, if you just want to have a better sense for what your options are, to schedule a peace of mind planning session with us, and
So,
we'll go over all of that.
yeah, so earlier we were talking about your presentation at the UN, and so I have a lot of international clients who have property in the United States. So definitely that would be my advice for them to have an opportunity to chat with you, especially because of the tax implications that we were talking about earlier, where you may, if you don't do it properly, you may have to. Leave money on the table, which you don't want to do. You want to be able to protect that asset and maximize your earnings. Really, it's a long-term investment. So thank you again. Really appreciate it. I just want to say thank you for those of you who are tuning in to the Financial Legacy podcast here with me, Maria Ellis, and with my guest, Laura Cowan. To learn more about how to work with us and my guests, go to the financiallegacy.live, where you could have a financial legacy and now estate planning complimentary consultation. So, here at the Financial Legacy podcast, we are changing lives one person at a time by helping you create a comprehensive financial and estate plan. To help you create and enjoy your financial success, contact us at financiallegacy.live for your complimentary consultation. Thank you again. Be well. Talk to you soon.